So,
So I was the first person ever to take Putnam really seriously and to draw out his thinking on every subject. And I viewed my job as really trying to understand him and then to re-express it in a way that other people could understand him, because he was extremely wedded to his own way of saying everything, his own language, which I dubbed Putnamese. And I remember I taped conversations, hoping to go, and then would go over them and ask him questions on every conversation we had later. I mean, we worked at this thing all day, every day, all summer for the years I was at Columbia, from 61 to 66.
let me ask you, how did you meet him? How did you did you know him at Princeton?
Yeah, I knew him. He came in, I think, a year after I did, although he was 10 years older than I was, and was working with John Wheeler. And I wasn't yet working with Wheeler, although I ended up doing so too. And Putnam was just this eccentric, solitary fellow around campus who once, I asked him something, and he turned to me and said, do you really want to know the answer to your question? So I was stuck, and I said, yeah. And then he launched into this incredibly complex, long answer. And right then I realized the guy was some kind of a genius, he had thought very deeply about everything. And so thus begun a serious and really almost formal mentor-apprentice relationship, which we carried on for 10 years and had an enormous effect on my life. I didn't become a disciple in the sense that I've devoted my life to trying to explain what Putnam was saying. Rather, it affected me, I think, in that it affected me as much from Putnam's breeding, his understanding of the workings of power in the world, the fact that he was from a wealthy, powerful family. He was able to communicate to me the workings of power, which is certainly one of the key reasons I became a young college president and went to Oberlin in that capacity when I was just 33. That never would have been possible without learning from Putnam how to speak effectively to people with power and standing and status. And so there were effects he had on me that were quite apart, really, from the intellectual content of all his philosophical thinking. Although that, too, I spent years trying to write expositions of, and did publish 2 pieces, one with him and one on my own, in which I acknowledge it's an attempt to explain his thinking.
Why is it so opaque? I mean, why is his writing, his thinking?
Well, this gets to a very interesting question about Putnam is, why did he fail? We know he succeeded, but he also failed. He failed to become known in Princeton, in the world. He really should, I think, be regarded as one of the great philosophers of the century. And no one's ever heard of him. And people who have, even John Wheeler, who's no dummy. I mean, Wheeler is one of the most celebrated physicists of the century. Putnam worked closely with him. Wheeler wrote a book recently published called Geons, Black Holes, and Quantum Foam with Kenneth Ford. In it, there's a photo of Putnam, and Putnam is described in the book. Do you know this, Barry?
No,
It's very important. Very important. However, what do they concentrate on? They concentrate on Putnam's homosexuality.
In that book?
Yeah. I think it's an outrage. I said to Ken Ford, this is like writing a book on Feynman and mainly mentioning the fact that he went to bottomless bars. I mean, he did something else, didn't he? Feynman won the Nobel Prize in Physics and is one of the couple greatest physicists of the century. I think Putnam is one of the couple greatest philosophers of the century, but all that really merited discussion in this book, apart from his eccentricity, was the fact that he had admitted to Wheeler fairly early on that he was gay. And I remember when that happened. I remember it differently than it is in Wheeler's book, because Putnam wrote the letter and I read it and we worked on it together before he mailed it to Wheeler acknowledging his homosexuality. And Putnam was terrified to do this and told me that when he dropped it in the mailbox, it was one of the critical moments of his life. So it was something he knew Wheeler was going to have difficulty coping with. I didn't even know Putnam was gay for, I forget, 5 or 8 years that we worked together. He was just a solitary fellow, and he concealed that part of his life from me. He was close friends with my wife at the time, Ann Fuller, and was godfather to Karen, our first child. And so why did Putnam fail? And I'm using that word with quotes around it, because, you know, he made...
Let me really pick that up, but I just wanted to ask, about 5 or 8 years ago, Wheeler gave a talk at, I forget what school it was, but this guy was, Aston Jones was there in the audience as a graduate student. And he waited in the long line, then went up to Wheeler and mentioned Putnam's name. And immediately he was the only person of interest in the whole place, and the whole faculty. He forgot about them. He said, let's get together for lunch.
Who?
Wheeler.
Wheeler said that to Jones.
To Jones.
Okay, go on.
And so they met the next day, and Wheeler told him that Putnam was one of the most brilliant students he ever had.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I interviewed him, he would not come forward and say that. I
No.
really tried to get him to say something positive, and he said, oh yeah, one time at Princeton there was a heated discussion, very passionate, and Putnam spoke very forcefully on the topic. Big deal. Another time in Europe, he was very helpful to me. He was able to find a place that would make posters for me.
This is the kind of thing that gets in this book. It's little nothings, you see. Because, see, Wheeler, when he goes public, has to be careful not to insult other of his graduate students, who are some of the most prominent physicists in the country now. And he doesn't want to put Putnam in their company, nor should he. Putnam never did any important physics, really.
Well, that's what he said. He said, I asked him, well, what do you think of Putnam's work? Well, he thought for a long time. He said, if anything comes from it, then it's important. And if not, then no. And the proof is in what happens.
Yeah,
basically.
but see, that gets at my point and my interest in what was it that was lacking in Putnam's work, what accounts for the fact that no one ever got it. I spent 10 years trying to explain this stuff to the world. Coleman Clark has spent a lot of time trying to master it and find a way of putting it that will engage other people. He's failed too. So, why? I think Putnam, almost because of his breeding, his upbringing, his very upper class status, his money, didn't feel he had to do the very hard work of popularizing his own ideas. Now, I don't mean popularizing in the sense of to the public in newspapers. I mean the first stage of popularization, the role I tried to play for him, which is popularizing it to the other academics, linking it to their syntax, linking it to the concepts they were using. A very important example of this was I went and studied neurophysiology, neuroanatomy. I even dissected a brain at Columbia Med School to try and do better by Putnam's work. And what's the matter, Barry? Is it not working?
No, it's working fine.
Oh,
It's
okay.
great.
Yeah,
When
okay.
you sit down a little bit lower, then I have to frame a little lower.
I see.
Be comfortable.
Okay,
Don't worry about
okay.
it. Everything is
Yeah,
great.
when I see you get distracted, it's harder for me to talk.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I came across in studying the neurophysiology the work of Donald Hebb, and it immediately resonated with what Putnam was saying, although Hebb, I think, anticipated Putnam's discovery of this particular idea. Putnam called it the NCRP, the Neural Conditioned Reflex Principle. Hebb, forget what Hebb called it, but it was the same thing. It was that when a nerve fires against another nerve, it increases its ability to do so later. There's something is secreted at the connection between the axon and the dendrite of the other cell or something. And so the resistance to firing the nerve is diminished every time it happens. Now, this is a key principle of explaining how behavior could be self-emergent out of a pile of neurons in a brain. So I brought this to Putnam's attention. I said, look at this guy Hebb. He seems to be saying something what you're saying. Well, Putnam's reaction was astounding. He dismissed it. He regarded Hebb as an idiot. He didn't take it seriously. That's exactly what he should have done, is take it very seriously. He should have linked all his stuff to what Hebb was doing and be willing to join another established scientist and work a little bit in Hebb's framework, a little bit in the traditional framework, if you will, in the traditional language. But Putnam just always stuck to his own way of seeing everything and saying everything, and that was, of course, essential to his originality, to his genius. But the unwillingness to link to other scientists' syntax cost him dearly. And is the reason, I think, that he never got the fame that his work really deserves and merits in terms of its originality and its content. The most important thing, I think Putnam will be known for, if his name ever does get out, is he was the first person I know of, and I think it can be documented, the first person ever in the world to recognize that the brain functions as a Darwin machine, that the brain works according to the principles that natural selection works by. That was why I finally, after getting this out of Putnam, he didn't put it that way. Needless to say, it took 3 years to get that sentence into existence. 3 years of conversations, hundreds of letters and discussion, in which I forced him to make diagrams, some of which are in our article in General Systems. I'll just quote this, give a reference to this article now, in case anyone ever wants to look it up. It's General Systems Yearbook of the Society for General Systems Research, Volume 11, 1966, page 99. And the article is called On the Origin of Order in Behavior, picking up on Darwin's famous title On the Origin of Species, because I finally realized that that's what Putnam was saying. I mean, all the original ideas are his. Some of the popularization is mine. And a lot of Putnam's clarifications only resulted because I hammered and hammered and hammered at him and forced him to say it in a way that I could understand it. And he'd get mad at me for being so slow. He'd be impatient with me and say I should do my own work. Well, that is the reason that no one else appreciates him. And I just viewed it as a foible then. Now I view it as a flaw because I'm trying to do the same thing myself in my own work, which is to explain it well enough so other people get it. I view that as part of the task of research. Wheeler's a genius at that, of course. Wheeler can write these books that are popular and engage the entire public on down to people who just read the sports pages. Wheeler has come up with ideas like black holes, which is now part of the vernacular. That may be why Wheeler is also impatient with Putnam's singular inattention to bridging from his own way of first understanding something to the way the academics understand it, and finally on all the way to the way that the public understands it. But I tried, in fact, to interest two well-known scholars now in Putnam's having been the first, to see the brain as a Darwin machine. They are Edelman, who got a Nobel Prize, not for his work on brain function, but for some other work, and William Calvin, who has several books on the brain as a Darwin machine. I think one of them has that title, more or less. And I wrote them letters and talked to Calvin in person. No response, no interest, no nothing. I even cited, the famous example of Mendel, who discovered the laws of genetics 20 years before they were rediscovered independently in Germany and other European countries by famous people. Well, one of these three independent rediscoverers of the Mendelian laws of genetics did a literature search and discovered this monk nobody had ever heard of named Gregor Mendel, who'd come up with the exact same laws 20 years earlier. And so out of his integrity, he cited Mendel for this. Did Calvin or Edelman cite Putnam? No.
They don't want to hear about it.
They don't want to hear about it.
It's a different era of what integrity means.
Absolutely. It's a different era of what integrity means. And I honor the fellows who cited Mendel almost as much as I do Mendel himself, for having the integrity and the scientific honesty to cite him for that. Their names are not known to anybody except for the fact that they rediscovered Mendel. Somebody's going to rediscover Putnam someday and realize that he was the first ever to see that the brain works by the same principles of natural selection as the animal kingdom has evolved.
The Calvin book, I think 10 years ago when we spoke, you recommended that, so I got it and I read it, or tried to read it. I couldn't find too much Putnam in that.
Well, there's no Putnam in that. I mean, no mention of Putnam. But the basic principle of seeing the brain in those natural selection terms was the essence of this article that Putnam basically originated for general systems. It was David Bohm, by the way, who's a fairly famous physicist, who did appreciate Putnam's insights and got us the opportunity to publish in this obscure journal at the University of Michigan.
Do you think Putnam, it always came as an issue that he felt that whenever he got a break of any sort, or wherever he was going to be in a faculty, it involved his family's money, and he would run like that, completely run. Do you think he compensated?
Perhaps so. I never heard him say that. He didn't even let on to me that his family had all this money very often. And at one point, I was the sole inheritor of Putnam's entire fortune. He wrote me a will out, and I had it for 10 years. And then at some point, he asked me to give it back to him, and I think he made someone else his executor, because we kind of lost touch in the 80s.
A law firm, I forget the name.
Yeah, I have.
He died last year, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I'd love to have interviewed him.
I have the letters from those people here. Letters from that law firm. I've talked to those lawyers. Putnam, I mean, I had two offices at Columbia, one in Pupin Lab with a physicist, one at Barnard College where I taught a course in elementary physics, and I gave Putnam the second office at Barnard where he lived and worked for years, for at least 5, maybe more years, all the years I was at Columbia. And that niche had nothing to do with Putnam's money. In fact, one of the things that's so curious about him is how he always lived very cheaply, would boil potatoes and onions back in the Barnard office, and he lived and worked there, which was just a few hundred yards from my other office, so it facilitated his and my working together, which we did intensely all those years I was at Columbia. That was when we published this article on the origin of order and behavior. And a year later, I published one other article on Putnam's work, which I should cite now just to get it into some kind of record, Barry. It's called Causal and Moral Law, Their Relationship as Examined in Terms of a Model of the Brain. I'm the sole author, although in the beginning I acknowledge it's just an exposition of Putnam's work. And it was published by Wesleyan University's Center for Advanced Study, Monday Evening Papers number 13 in 1967. And it's about what most intrigued me about Putnam initially, namely that he had a philosophical system that linked and made a unity of causal law on the one hand and moral law on the other hand. He said they weren't two separate bodies of disjoint laws, that the moral law could be reduced to causal law through the intermediation of a model of how the nervous system works, which would itself be causally grounded in the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. So that, I think, is going to be his overarching insight. His greatest claim to fame is to see those two as one. And that idea so intrigued me initially, probably in the very first conversation we ever had, and it's played a central role in my thinking ever since.
That's also what Coleman Clark says, is precisely that was the most interest to him. He came from a Baptist, his parents were Baptist missionaries in Japan, and as well as his grandparents and great-grandparents. So he came to college in this country, and in the first semester he was totally blown apart. His whole, what he calls the supernatural way of reading the Bible as being, real and factual. And he began to study science as well as religion. And he had this great schism.
Right.
And so that when he heard about Putnam and went to his class, it seemed to him that he was this person who was putting the two of them together. And he spent the last 35 years trying to understand that. And I hope that it comes to some. Do you think Putnam succeeds in doing that, and how?
Well, I do think he did. I think his model of the nervous system, although rudimentary, was, as I said, the first to reduce it to mechanism. And if you reduce the instrument that discerns or invents these moral laws to causal principles, you've thereby reduced the laws themselves to causal principles, although there are other ways of seeing this unification than that. So I think Putnam's work, especially the full body of it, the 60-odd book-length manuscripts, do accomplish this, and a professional philosopher could sort it out better than I can. Maybe Coleman Clark has sorted it all out. You see, you could see why it would be of such interest to Putnam, who lived a secret life in which he felt which he was told at least, he was violating some moral principles, because when we were growing up, homosexuality was regarded as evil, as sin, as a violation of biblical or moral principles. And yet Putnam felt, I think, that it would emerge naturally in his own life. So it's no accident that someone who felt he was beyond the pale in morality would be the person to insist that the behaviors emerging naturally in him, which had to be causal, they were caused, these behaviors couldn't also be immoral or amoral. They had to be, that forced him, I think, to try and unify causal and moral principles so that he wouldn't have to live with the fact or regard himself as evil for his homosexuality, which he concealed at the time, as did almost all homosexuals. It would be so interesting if he were alive today, when now homosexuality is widely accepted and soon will be completely accepted, I believe. And so in a way, that's a political vindication of Putnam's insight, the fact that the popular view of what was regarded as evil behavior when in the 50s or before is now no longer so regarded. It's regarded as caused. In fact, there are genetic explanations even. Who knows if they're right, but Putnam was always looking for explanations of homosexuality. I mean, he studied Proust, he studied all these psychologists trying to understand, I think, himself. What has Coleman written about the unification of causal and moral law?
As far as I can tell, he's written very, very little. Oh, he
I wrote
studies
about it, by the way. I always wrote a paper every summer I worked with Putnam, and one of them, was really the jackpot issue for me, was called the it was called The Origin and Development of Values, written in Amherst, July 27th, 1964. And it was, basically another one of my attempts to explain Putnam's thinking on the unification of causal and morality. And that's what the one at Wesleyan was about. It was presented as a Monday evening paper. All the fellows at the Center for Advanced Study gave papers, and I gave this one on Putnam's work. And there were some very famous people there. Putnam had been offered a position there with me. We were both offered positions. He declined his. It was the 66-7, and it was a very posh, prestigious position. The other fellows were people like Stephen Spender, I.A. Richards, Richard Goodwin, who'd just come out of the Johnson administration, and others. And we had free housing and a stipend that was plenty. It was about 12 grand, back then, for a year. And we gave papers, and I spent the whole year giving a course on Putnam's thinking to about 20 undergraduates at Wesleyan, one of whom became very famous. One of whom is John Perry Barlow, who's one of the gurus of the computer age thinking, and was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and is a wealthy individual. And I ran into him a few years ago, and he said, that course you taught on brain function was the most important educational experience of my life. Yeah, and again, it was Putnam's influence coming through. And I would call Putnam as I was preparing the lectures, and this was a course, that covered everything. It covered the development of civilization in different countries, how the brain works, philosophy of mathematics. It covered everything. And Barlow, for one, was affected by it, apparently. I'd lost track of him completely, but he showed up in the Global Business Network setting, of which I was a part, and he immediately came up to me and commented on that. And I thought, there's another example of Putnam's continuing influence in the world.
A lot of people are touched, but unless it gets formalized in some way.
No, he'll never be known, you see, and he should be known like Wittgenstein is known. Another guy, incidentally, who struggled with homosexuality. At least he wrote one or two books, and they're opaque and obscure, but at least he got a reputation. Putnam couldn't be bothered to write his stuff so anyone else could understand it. He would be bothered, extremely conscientious actually, about explaining it to someone like me who bugged him about it, or probably Coleman Clark or others who worked with him, Robert Horn. This woman you mentioned, what's her name?
Nancy Johnson?
Nancy Johnson.
He did. He explained
it he went
to years, but
he went to great lengths to explain it. I mean, you must have sensed something original and useful in the philosophy itself, right?
I would say totally influenced my career. Totally influenced what I'm doing now.
What's the connection?
Well, in the first place, just as Wheeler thought nothing of what Putnam was doing, Putnam basically thought nothing of what I was originally doing. Not of the documentaries, which I got a lot of money for, not a lot of money, but paid for. But prior to that, I was making experimental films, in which the basic idea was you have a visual image, you have painting, that's a long tradition, and then you have music, and that's a long tradition, it comes from a different place. And we come to the point where, let's say you have all this modern painting culminating in, let's say, Jackson Pollock, and let's say John Cage, where you have that whole tradition is now little bitty pieces. Well, it's time to synthesize music and painting, not to sync one to the other, which is done all the time in MTV or many other places, but to actually think, to conceptually think audiovisually, if that's possible. In order to do that, you need not two different machines, not a guitar and not a paintbrush. You need one machine to do both of those things. And when you can begin to do that, you can begin to think, conceptually think audiovisually. Well, the only way I could do that 35 years ago was by hand painting strips of movie film, painting the sound on the edge and painting the image in the middle. And I did that for 5 years, but it's incredibly hard to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I did it as hard as I could, and then I stopped. I said, there's no place further. You can't go further. You can't get the detail, etc. And I always pushed away computers because it didn't look good enough. Well, now computers are looking great.
Yeah, of
now
course.
I have stuff on the screen. It's fantastic. And you still have two different systems. You go to one store to buy your music stuff. You go to another store. But there are a few programs, like After Effects, which is basically an animation program, but there's enough sound in that program that I can work with it.
Yeah.
And I have been doing that for a year and a half. And Putnam said, "Why isn't that interesting?" That was it.
Yeah.
But I think that that's complete. That's from Putnam. I mean, that's. Although, we really did see eye to eye. A year before I ever met Putnam, I wrote a paper for Columbia on Hot Crane. I loved Hot Crane. Putnam loved Hot Crane. There were other things where we saw eye to eye. But he made the comment, of all the people who have ever been connected with my work, you're the only person that cannot say one word about it. You cannot describe or explain or pull up even one word about what it is I've talked about all these years. And that's true. But that's just
Putnam made that comment about you?
Yes.
That you cannot pull up one word to describe. What does he
word.
mean? I don't understand, because you've just talked for 5 minutes about
I'm
it.
better at it now than I was 20 years ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I've matured or something.
Yeah, right.
I really am, but I'm not.
Well, see, Putnam's criticism of you can be turned on him. He had 10 million words about what he was doing, and not one of them penetrated the general academic world. So you see, we always critique others for what it is we feel we're failing to do ourselves. We're most sensitive to the failures in others that we feel we have ourselves. And Putnam probably did feel badly that he hadn't engaged the attention of anyone at Princeton, in the academic part of Princeton. And I think Putnam actually held it against me that I failed to make his work, to get his work acceptance and recognition in the academic world. There was a bitterness there that affected our relationship at the end. When I left Oberlin after 4 years, he was gloating. He thought, aha, they've kicked you out. He was manifestly happy that when he thought I had failed there. Now, I didn't think I failed at all. I resigned and left voluntarily and finished the job I came to do and wanted to do something else and not become an administrator for life. So, I was flabbergasted when I realized that he had heard some gossip. And of course, there's always gossip in every academic community. Half the people hate the president, especially in 1973 and 4 and late 60s, when presidents were so controversial. So naturally, he could pick up gossip that I had failed at Oberlin. But he relished it. And that appalled me and shocked me. And it showed me that he bore a resentment that I had gone on to a position of prominence, and he had not. And his work had not met with any recognition and success.